Chapter 22, Section 3. Too much for sale, too little to spend. Industry had thrived in the 1920s because manufacturers were able to make a lot of merchandise very quickly. The ability to mass produce a wide range of consumer goods started the stock boom. However, for mass production to succeed, people had to buy the goods being churned out of factories. By the late 1920s, demand for consumer goods could not keep up with production. People simply could not afford to buy all that was being produced. The resulting glut of goods in the market, combined with a stock market crash and bank crisis, caused the economy to collapse. Overproduction puts too many goods in stores. By 1920, most American factories were using the assembly line method of mass production. As a result, they were able to make more goods more quickly than ever before. Between 1923 and 1929, the output per worker hour in manufacturing increased an astounding 32%. Farm output, too, increased throughout the 1920s. New machines and new farming techniques expanded farm production even while demand for farm products was falling. In general, companies welcomed increased production because it means increased income. A company that makes appliances, for example, wants to produce as many refrigerators as possible because the more refrigerators it makes, the more it can sell. The more refrigerators a company sells, the more money it earns. If making refrigerators costs less than it did before, so much the better. Trouble arises when there are not enough consumers to buy all those products rolling off the assembly lines and arriving from the farms. Economists call such a predicament overproduction. The term refers to a situation in which more products are being created than people can afford to buy. As the 1920s came to an end, overproduction overwhelmed the American economy. A widening wealth gap leads to rising debt. Greater productivity led to greater profits for businesses. Some of the profits went to workers, whose wages rose steadily in the 1920s, but workers' wages did not go up nearly enough for them to consume as much as manufacturers were producing. Most business profits went to a relatively small number of people. A wide gap separated the rich from the working class. On one side of the gap, the wealthiest 5% of American families received about a third of all the money earned in the country. That was more than the 60% of all the families at the bottom of the income scale earned. Moreover, an estimated 40% of all Americans lived in poverty. For a time, Americans made up for the unequal distribution of wealth by using credit to buy the radios, cars, and household appliances that flooded the market. The growing advertising industry also helped persuade people that thrift was an old-fashioned value. The more modern approach was to borrow money to buy the latest products right away. Between 1921 and 1929, personal debt more than doubled from $3.1 billion to $6.9 billion. Underconsumption causes farm failures, bankruptcies, and layoffs. By 1929, the buying spree was coming to an end. Many Americans found themselves deep in debt and were unwilling or unable to borrow more. Even the wealthy, who could afford to buy whatever they wanted, were buying less because they had all the goods they needed. One historian remarked that by 1929, everyone who could buy a car or radio probably already had one. The economy was showing signs of underconsumption. This means that people were not buying as much as the economy was producing. It is the flip side of overproduction. Farmers were the first to experience the pain of underconsumption. Their financial difficulties began after World War I, a full decade before industry began to suffer. During the war, farmers had prospered by supplying food for American soldiers and the people of war-torn Europe. When the war ended, those markets disappeared. Consumption of farm products decreased, causing prices to drop. Underconsumption affected farms in another way. It caused them to go further into debt. Farm incomes were falling, but farmers still wanted to buy goods made by industry, such as cars, tractors, and appliances. Like everyone else, farmers borrowed money and paid for their goods in installments. As agricultural prices continued to decline, more and more farmers had difficulty making their payments. Some farmers lost everything they owned when banks seized their farms as payment for their debts. As a result, for the first time in the nation's history, the number of farms and farmers began to decline. By the late 1920s, the problem of underconsumption had spread to industry. Responding to the glut of products on the market, many manufacturers cut back production. In the auto and steel industries, for example, production declined by as much as 38% by the end of 1930. Some companies lost so much business that they were forced to declare bankruptcy and close down altogether. Whether business decreased production or went bankrupt, the result was the same for workers: unemployment. As industry declined, companies laid off many workers. Those who lost their jobs also lost the ability to buy the products that industry produced. A vicious downward spiral consisting of layoffs, reduced consumption, and then more layoffs was set in motion. Between 1929 and 1933, the unemployment rate rose from 3% of the American workforce to 25%. Millions of Americans found themselves out of work and, as the Depression wore on, out of hope.